All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in snowy Philadelphia. My research was devoted to mapping out part of the clusters of neurons that are involved in anxiety and addiction. And I hope everybody's been staying safe and, reasonably sane. As you can tell, I'm pretty sane for the most part right now. But, given all the recent good news regarding the vaccines that are on the way, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Just hold fast. Keep wearing your masks, keeping your distance. We're almost there. Okay, so the topic I wanted to talk about today is actually related to the reason we've all experienced this radical change in our lives, COVID-19. But while I have, any scientist in the biomedical sciences, while I've been paying attention to what we've learned about the biology of the virus, one story that's been particularly interesting has been the effects of the virus on people's sense of smell. Specifically, that some people have lost their sense of smell following infection with SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, in addition to a few other odd symptoms that have been observed among a subset of COVID-19 patients. The loss of smell has been one of the primary symptoms that cause a lot of biomedical scientists to wonder if there might be some neurological component to COVID-19. That possibility, of a neurological component to COVID-19 has been something I've discussed in the past, but more recently, I've discussed evidence that the virus can successfully infect neurons in organoids, and that components of the viral particle are capable of passing the blood-brain barrier. And I've put links to the most recent ones in the description below. But there's a beautiful article that was published in the New York Times Magazine that does an excellent job of knitting a lot of these threads together. And, the story touches on an institution with which I interacted while working on my own PhD, the Mammals Chemical Sciences Center. And, specifically, I interacted with rising scientists who were working at the Mammals Center, which is it's honestly one of the coolest places about which I've ever heard that's devoted to sensory research in general, right? Like we had, neuroscience labs that were devoted to sensory systems, of course, at my graduate institution, vision, olfaction, gustation, and so on. But they were, just a handful of labs in our department. At Mammals, you have a concentration of some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, all working to understand how our brain makes sense of all of our incoming sensory information, right? And one of the most brilliant scientists with whom I ever worked is now a principal investigator at Mammals. So, if you or someone is interested in pursuing neuroscience and has an interest in how our brain takes in information from our environment, and might want to live in the best city in the United States, Philadelphia, of course, contact me and I'll connect you, because I'm sure she'd be interested. So, back to today's topic. There was this excellent article written by Brooke Jarvis in the New York Times Magazine, published just a few days ago. And while some of what I'll talk about today is derived from paywalled articles, right? Scientific publications. This article is openly available and not absurdly overpriced like scientific publications are. And so part of the reason I recommend this article is that she does, this good job of telling the story of how this symptom went from just being sort of a strange observation, just sort of a quirk, to being potentially very meaningful. And not only that, but she describes herself as being anosmic, meaning unable to smell. An interesting perspective, on any relationship between COVID-19 and olfaction, right? From somebody who has never had the sense of smell. So I, like many of the people with whom I discussed this observation, there's a weirdly consistent, while not completely common outcome of SARS-CoV-2, what was this loss of the ability to smell, or anosmia. And I, like a lot of my peers, just assumed it was almost certainly just attributable to just a blockage of the nose, right? Just like when people catch a cold, sometimes caused by other coronaviruses, by the way, my first instinct was just, this whole story was just like a hypersensitivity that people had to any effect of the virus, but was likely just attributable to inflammation of the nose. And, I recall when I caught, a lingering bug, years ago, I recall using that nasal decongestant Afrin. And I definitely don't recommend using it, but it just rapidly opened up my whole nasal situation, right? But while my ability to smell had been attenuated by having the whole anatomy just swollen and infected, even after opening it up with Afrin, my ability to smell was still pretty attenuated. So, there's almost certainly like an independent effect of that decongestant of, Afrin on the ability to smell, like just due to vasoconstriction, which is basically what it does. It just like forces blood vessels in the nose to become tiny. But, when hearing these stories of COVID-19 induced anosmia, loss of the ability to smell, I assume that, many of the examples were due to just similar combinations of like inflammation and the use of like cold medications and vasoconstriction and stuff. And I know at the time I wasn't alone. Like a lot of the folks in biomed with whom I discussed this quirky symptom had similar suspicions, right? But we all sort of anticipated there might be something to this, right? As time went on. So Jarvis, the author of that article, brings up that Claire Hopkins, who is the president of the British Rhinological Society in London, she was used to seeing patients who were dealing with anosmia following a viral infection in general, right? And so just so you have a sort of a sense of the roadmap here. And so, inflammation from the infection prevents odorants from reaching olfactory receptors. And so, I'm showing here like a really simplified picture of like some of the relevant anatomy, right? And, I assume you're pretty familiar with your nose, right? It's on the front of your face, points forward, 2 holes. And so, behind that is the nasal cavity, right? But more importantly, there are olfactory receptors along those olfactory nerves that are colored in yellow up there, that look sort of like a brush of some kind, right? Extending from our sort of shrimpy olfactory bulb, relative to other primates and other mammals. But it's those receptors that bind molecules that literally float through the air, find their way up into our nose, and literally bind those receptors, right? That realization, by the way, that like our sense of smell and taste is the byproduct of like molecules binding receptors like on our body, connected to our nervous system. It can be a little mind-blowing, maybe a little upsetting. Like when you walk into a bakery and smell some delicious sourdough baking, molecules hitting those receptors, telling you that some, delicious bread was just baked. Or when you walk into a Five Guys or a Shake Shack or a Chipotle or whatever, or at least when you used to, those were molecules, hitting those receptors, subconsciously indicating to you that some delicious burgers or whatever are available in this place. Right? When you smell a carton of milk to get a sense of whether it's, still good, molecules hitting those receptors. And when you walk into like a public restroom, or, when you walked into a public restroom, I don't have to draw it out for you. Molecules hitting those receptors, right? So if you're interested on the origins of where this weird sensory system of ours, dependent upon molecules literally binding receptors that are on like inside of our body, there's an excellent review article right here, written by, and you're gonna have to forgive me for my pathologically American pronunciation here, but Kazuyuki Taniguchi and Kazumi Taniguchi, and this was published in 2014, and I highly recommend it. And particularly if you're interested in like the story of how it is that we've come to have this strange sense. And they explore the argument that olfaction, and they're not the only people that make this argument, but that olfaction or sense of smell is the earliest sensory system that appears in our evolutionary history. They explore that argument, and it kind of makes sense, right? So, like, after all, us animals, including we primates, the Homo sapiens, we ultimately evolved from organisms that developed in water, right? They're floating around in water. And so, those organisms navigated their watery environments, in part, at least, by detecting molecules that were dissolved in the water, in which they existed, right? Because the molecules would bind receptors that the organisms had evolved to produce, and they'd respond to the presence of a specific molecule, maybe one that they could use to produce energy, or, one that might threaten their survival, might be toxic in some way, by moving towards or away from them. And so, by the way, like a particularly useful tool to help govern those decisions might just be how good we'd predict, how effectively we'd predict moving towards those molecules might feel, right? Perhaps something like an emotional reaction, right? Rather than just, having it sort of be a simple system where it's like food, no food, food, danger. Rather, if you have this gradient of behavioral sort of a behavioral rudder in the form of emotions, it might be pretty useful, right? So that's what we're talking about. I couldn't help myself. I'm a guy who studied anxiety and addiction, right? I think emotion is far more important than a lot of people give it credit for being. But so anyways, that's what we're talking about, right? The most primitive of mechanisms by which organisms probed their environment. And so, general inflammation of this whole pathway up here will inevitably prevent that process from happening, right? And that's what Claire Hopkins was used to seeing. But she began to notice a pattern. Claire Hopkins is the president of the British Rhinological Society. So that's what she was used to seeing, right? But she began to notice a pattern, and then, received word from a colleague in Italy, which you'll remember was one of the first countries outside of China that was hit really heavily by COVID-19. What she noticed is that many of the frontline clinicians were also losing their ability to smell. And then next, she heard from a colleague or clinician in France, which, as you'll remember, was hit hard by the virus soon after Italy. And this clinician remarked about an odd increase in the frequency of people remarking about their loss of their senses of smell. So then, physicians in the United States described similar observations, followed by Iran, along with intriguing frequencies of the same observations in China and in South Korea. And there was even an exploration of this weird symptom, this loss of smell, in Germany, finding that it was strangely frequent among people who were infected early on. Okay, so next, Rudy Gobert, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He's a basketball player in the NBA here in the United States. He was pretty skeptical of COVID-19 at the time, which was early March of 2020, right? So pretty early on when it hit the United States. And I highly recommend checking out an article that USA Today has called A Minute-by-Minute Look at March 11th, the night Rudy Gobert tested positive for COVID-19 and changed sports. So the NBA response was embarrassingly enough one of the initial major events that incited an actual policy response from the federal government, as paltry as it was. But the NBA decision was pretty significant, and there's some really interesting videos in that article, which I've linked below, that'll almost certainly exist, in whatever the equivalent of history books will be decades from now. Just wild to sort of go back in time and watch how people were reacting. And, to be clear, I don't think personally that player deserves any negative, attention for how he reacted. I think the leadership of the country, right, deserves that kind of attention. But, Gobert ultimately remarked that he had also lost his sense of smell. So Brooke Jarvis, the author of the New York Times Magazine article, she highlights the reality that human olfaction has been largely underemphasized. Okay, and so, at least when it comes to research priorities relative to the other sensory systems, she tells this interesting story of scientists associating olfaction with lesser creatures, that humans had transcended, right, such a lowly sensory system, as evidenced by the anatomical trajectory of the human brain, right, and olfactory regions relative to those simpler organisms. Okay, so I think we'll do that. Okay. So I'm going to refer you to this article. It's pretty fun, by a scientist named John McGann, which was published in Science in 2017. And I strongly suspect that Brooke Jarvis, the New York Times author, I strongly suspect she read it, particularly since she references Paul Broca, specifically, who, classified humans as non-smellers, not owing to any sensory testing, but because he believed that the evolutionary enlargement of the human frontal lobe gave human beings free will at the expense of the olfactory system, right? That was Paul Broca's sort of argument. And I'm going to show you some pictures from McGann's article in Science. It is a very interesting article. That I believe is openly available online. It's not paywalled. But the fundamental argument that he makes is that we have a thoroughly distorted appreciation of human olfaction. And so, I recommend checking it out. Link in the description, of course. So it's going to involve, some of these pictures will involve anatomical images. So if you're squeamish, you may want to just fast forward a bit or pause or something like that. But otherwise, so here we go. So here you're seeing images of the human brain and a mouse brain, and then on either side of a central picture here, right? So in the middle, what you're seeing is a zoomed in picture that includes the olfactory bulb, right? So you're just zooming in on that little box there, and so on the image, in the image on the left, right, you're seeing a small section of the brain that includes the olfactory bulb or bulbs, right? Bilateral structure. And so, as you remember from our earlier picture, the olfactory bulb is a structure that receives stimulation from all the receptors on our nose, or in our nose, that detect the presence of molecules, right, in the air that we breathe in. And so, as you can tell, the olfactory bulb relative to the rest of the mouse brain over here, it's pretty gigantic, right? In the human brain, it's like a tiny little smear along the ventral surface, like the bottom of the brain. But as a nerd who appreciates the talent that goes into really good cooking, a properly cooked steak or burger, really good pasta, or for me, the smell of properly cooked lobster. But simpler things like an excellent apple or mango or tangerine or herbs like rosemary or basil, like a strong basil. As an admirer of those olfactory experiences, I'm partial to the argument that McGann makes in this article in Science. So he notes that the olfactory bulbs in all primates are similarly flattened and pushed under the swollen frontal lobes of the human brain. Swollen is my words, not his word. But he notes that it's this anatomical positioning that rendered olfaction to be considered a lesser sensory system. And so McGann gets into some of the very strange and interesting history behind how bishops in the French Senate treated Paul Broca, right? And yeah, if you're familiar with Broca's area, right, involved in language processing, very, very important classic anatomical structure in the brain, we're talking about that same Broca, right? That's the Broca. So anyway, so the bishops evidently influenced the work of Paul Broca, such that he'd couch his anatomical work in a way that would reinforce a broader social context in which he was working, right? Happened quite a bit over the years in science. And so once again, I recommend checking out this article. It's a great story. Particularly if you're interested in this argument that the human sense of smell isn't as bad as we're sort of led to believe. But, so to cut to the chase, McGann highlights an anatomical comparison between the mouse olfactory bulb and the human olfactory bulb, which you can see here. And, obviously the human olfactory bulb is like massive relative to the mouse olfactory bulb. So as you can see, human on one side, mouse on the other. And so he highlights some of the other, interesting evidence that the volume of the human olfactory bulb can vary actually quite a bit as a function of childhood experiences. And, relevantly to our topic today, olfaction influenced by COVID-19 and human olfaction in general, hyposmia, right, meaning like a reduced ability to smell, can be associated with some pretty significant changes in size, like on the scale of like 20 to 25% in like the volume of the olfactory bulb. That's crazy. That's a huge swing. And so McGann gets into some of the more granular anatomical comparisons that are frankly like quite interesting. Like humans seem to have 16 olfactory bulb glomeruli that are like basically processing information from each odor receptor, compared to just 2 in olfactory bulb glomeruli doing the same thing in the rodent, right? So 16 per receptor in human, 2 per receptor in mice. Of course, rodents, like mice and rats, are known to be highly driven by olfactory sensory information, by their sense of smell, more driven by their sense of smell than their vision, right? And so he closes with the argument that we humans actually have a very, very rich olfactory experience that is, it's available to us, but it's just context dependent, right? So he writes this, quote, dogs may be better than humans at discriminating the urines on a fire hydrant, and humans may be better than dogs at discriminating the odors of fine wine. But few such comparisons have actual experimental support. When properly tested, the primate olfactory system is highly sensitive to many odors and can exert strong influences on behavior, physiology, and emotions. Okay, I love it. Okay, there we go. Okay, anatomy picture's gone. You can, if you're squeamish, you can return. So I've talked about some of the evidence that human olfaction seems to play like a major role in consciousness, aspects about which we're both aware and unaware. And I've discussed some of this evidence in a podcast episode that I've linked below, of course. But suffice it to say that there's some very intriguing evidence that there are some thoroughly subconscious olfactory influences on behavior, including like how we find people attractive, with some particularly like interesting connections to the immune system. So check it out if you're interested in that whole story. But so the short story here, I believe I was exposed to this whole line of research, just touched on it when I was in college. But so I'll give you the sort of the synopsis. So short story is that there are studies that have shown that heterosexual men and women seem to subconsciously be influenced by exposure to odorants that are purported to be either male-specific or female-specific. So there's even a study that showed that women in the United States, when exposed to a purportedly male-specific odorant. It's a little bit controversial that whether it is actually male-specific, but for the purposes of this study and this conversation, male-specific odorants, only men produce this odor, this molecule. So when exposed to those odors, women would tend to drink more alcohol-type beverages when given the option than those who are exposed to control scents. Interesting. There's a whole conversation, a whole world to be explored there as to why that might be the case. But one of the stranger and more interesting lines of research has found that animals in general will tend to be more attracted to potential mates who have very different forms of a very important part of the immune system, the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC proteins. It's not super important what they do or how they work, but they're basically parts of the immune system that help the immune system to avoid attacking your own body, right? How part of the immune system recognizes self from foreign. So the part of the human genome that encodes these proteins, these MHC proteins, happens to be quite polymorphic, meaning that it can come in many different flavors throughout the population, in different people. And there are data that suggest that animals will tend to find potential mates who have rather different MHC genes more attractive. And so there's this theory that's been around since about 1995, I believe, from a scientist named I think it's Wedekind or Wedekind. And so Klaus Wedekind, he performed some pretty infamous studies, or at least at this point, that explored human olfaction, right? And so probably the most famous involved asking a group of women to rate body odors of similarly aged men using T-shirts that were worn while the guys were sleeping, right, to collect their body odors. And so it was about 50 men and 50 women who participated, with about half of the women taking birth control, hormonal birth control. So interestingly, it turned out that the menstrual cycle appeared to play a role in this odor MHC protein preference, right? Women who weren't on birth control tended to rate the odors of men with MHC proteins that were the least similar to them as being the most pleasant. And the smell of men with different MHC proteins reminded them of their current or previous mate's smell, right? More frequently than the odors of men whose MHC proteins were more similar to them, right? And so, interestingly, women who were on birth control tended to prefer the smell of MHC similar men, okay? And so, and this was something that they observed that was exhibited by pregnant women as well, okay? And so, evidently these studies have been criticized for a whole variety of reasons. So it's definitely not exactly a consensus, but interesting nonetheless, right? But a group in 2008, and so this was not Wedekind, conducted, so this was a different, group of scientists. They tested participants 2 times, okay? And it was about 100 men and 100 women who had their MHC genes sequenced. So half of the females began using hormonal contraception about 2 weeks after the first test, right? 2 weeks after the first test, half began using the birth control pill. And so they explored any potential effect of hormonal signaling on this whole potential dynamic, okay? And this group found a significant shift in the preference among birth control pill users, right? They tended to prefer MHC similar men, just like Wedekind or Wedekind's group found, right? That first study that I brought up, though they didn't identify any other odor-based attraction, okay? Just that similar sort of shift in preference. And so another set of experiments were published in 2003, okay? And these were headed up by a scientist named Thornhill, who evaluated the relationships between body odor, MHC proteins, and facial attractiveness. Interestingly, they observed that there was a preference for female odors that did correlate with MHC dissimilarity, right, among male smellers. But females didn't exhibit, the preference in their study, right? So in other words, men, male preference for certain female odors, but it wasn't, the reverse wasn't true in their study. So interesting evidence that perhaps we are somehow weirdly sensitive to MHC proteins. And so the last study I'll bring up was done by a group in Germany in 2006. And so what they did is they focused on whether they might be able to detect any EEG-based signaling that would correlate with people being exposed to either similar or different MHC proteins, right? Exposing to odors, trying to detect some kind of signal of neuronal activity, generally speaking, towards the outside of the brain. And what they found, that there were larger EEG potentials, which again, basically just like indications of neuronal activity, okay? They found that there were larger EEG potentials and a more rapid signal when people were exposed to samples with similar MHC proteins. And men who were smelling the odors from other men tended to exhibit more frontal activity more rapidly, while women smelling the odors of other women tended to have greater activity in parietal areas. So frontal, parietal is about, somewhere around here. So this group argues, this German group argues that faster and larger responses to the odors of MHC similar people may be part of a system that evolved to make it very easy for us and our evolutionary ancestors, of course, from whom we inherited this potential system, to rapidly and easily detect if someone is closely related to us, possibly helping to avoid inbreeding. So it's not like this system would have just evolved because it would be nice to have, right? That's not the way to think about this, the evolution of aspects of consciousness, right? Rather, and I should say subconsciousness, but rather that the humans, in our primate ancestors, who had some kind of system to help reduce inbreeding, would likely have greater reproductive success because their offspring would be less likely to suffer the potential genetic consequences of inbreeding. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of other fun studies that were done in this kind of domain of research, like exploring the possible influences of MHC proteins and preferences for finding certain facial features attractive, and then and explicitly when asked to identify attractiveness specifically in the context of trying to identify a potential long-term partner. And so you can check it out again in the podcast I linked below for like a deeper dive into these studies. It's a really fun and interesting area of research, definitely controversial, and a source of ongoing debate, but still quite interesting. So anyways, back to COVID, back to Jarvis's article. So and McGann's article. So I'm not entirely convinced by McGann's argument, okay? Though it is very interesting. His argument being that the human olfactory system is far more robust and comprehensive than we sort of popularly appreciate. But anyway, so Brooke Jarvis, the author of the article in New York Times Magazine, she name checks McGann in her article, right? So she brings his argument up. And she doesn't go into all the details, right? But she does an excellent job of like conveying the fundamental point, right? That our sense of smell is at least a very important instrument, right? In the song of our consciousness, right? It's not just some kind of background nothing. It actually plays a significant role. Back to the Jarvis article, right? So she reveals that she's anosmic, right? As I brought up earlier, unable to smell. And she writes something that struck me as pretty interesting. So, quote, "One thing you notice when you can't smell is how much time people who can smell spend talking about it. Friends are always curious about whether I can taste food. I love food, though I care primarily about the textures and the flavors than the actual taste buds perceive. But that's the main difference they imagine. They don't seem to realize all the other ways that smell is constantly on their minds. Smell is no big deal until it's missing." So that passage reminds me of how I react to like conversations that I've had with people who experience synesthesia, how they describe the way they experience their various sensory stimuli, right? Like seeing sounds, hearing colors. To them it's just completely and utterly like normal, mundane. It's not like they were, bitten by a radioactive spider or something and, could all of a sudden interact with colors and sounds at some whole new level, right? It's not like they just got a superpower all of a sudden. It's like, wow, this is really cool. It's just as normal as you seeing and hearing me right now on your device. I have to imagine that's how, like, the availability of sensory systems are in general for us. It's just normal. And so there's a quote from someone who contributed to a group that Claire Hopkins, that president of the British Rhinological Society in London, a quote from somebody who was contributing to her work, that I literally wrote this down because it was rather evocative. So funny enough, a friend of mine who's a scientist in a totally different field, right, did exactly the same and brought it up with me when she read this article. Quote, "I'm inhaling and there's nothing there." I don't know. It's a little bit eerie. It's a simple quote, right? But it's also kind of nightmarish, right? At least for me, So let me tell you the first thing I do every morning when my 2-year-old baby is awake. I say her name. She looks at me. She puts on this shy sort of smile and then trots over to me and hugs my leg. I lift her up and immediately smell her head. Literally every single day. All right, I smell her head. It's like ambrosia. And I have to imagine she's going to develop a whole complex about how much I'm like smelling her head. Her mother does the same thing, by the way. But and there's this whole giant body of literature, scientific literature, devoted to the role that olfaction, again, the sense of smell, plays in reproduction and maternal behavior, that I'm not going to get into. But like, suffice it to say that there's a fair bit of evidence that humans respond to olfaction in very substantial ways that directly influences, childhood development, maternal attachment, familial attachment, these types of things. So, I'm certain that I'd develop some other ritual, right, in the absence of olfaction with my daughter. Probably like just tousle her hair or tickle her or something. There are plenty of other bonding mechanisms, but at least for me, the notion that there would just be nothing when I smell her head, like it just amplified my desire to avoid this virus as much as I can. So Jarvis highlights an interesting project, okay, smelltracker.org, link in the description, which is a project where people can report changes in their ability to smell common household items, standardized, right, as a way to keep a record of how that their olfactory sensitivity, their sense of smell, evolves over time, particularly if and when they were exposed to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Pretty cool project, both as a tool to like track the effects of SARS-CoV-2 on our sensory systems, as well as just like how olfaction may or may not change as we get older. Like, for example, it's quite common for our olfactory system to change as we get older. I'm pretty sure that that's what's happened to me. Like, I used to pretty much hate spicy food, meaning like really spicy food. But after tasting this specific Sichuan dish a few years ago, I was pretty much immediately converted. But, I was approaching 30 years old. And I have to imagine there have been some pretty meaningful biological changes that occurred, making me at least slightly less sensitive to the spiciness, or more sensitive to other flavors that were present alongside the spiciness, right? And, it's not like it's particularly unique to have an evolving palate, right, as we get older. Sensory preferences for flavors, for smells and stuff. And in some cases, the way it evolves may help to indicate, emerging pathologies, by the way. So a variety of conditions are associated with changes in our sense of smell, from schizophrenia and Parkinson's to psychiatric conditions like depression. There are even some arguments that some people make, not the big majority, but some people make, that we ought to be using our sense of smell as a diagnostic mechanism to predict if somebody's going to develop some of these conditions before they become like overtly, manifest. So anyways, Jarvis goes on to make like a broader argument, right, that we're all underestimating the importance of olfaction to our conscious experience. And ultimately, I think the argument she makes, which is clearly inspired by McGann, by the scientist who wrote your olfactory system is better than you think it is. I think fundamentally that they're correct, that we're all likely taking our sense of smell for granted. And, I think there's probably an evolutionary explanation for why it is that olfaction just doesn't occupy the share of our conscious experience that, the same share that vision does. It's just not nearly as effective an update on, environmental surroundings, right? Photons travel much, much, much faster than molecules traveling through the air. And so, like, as a predator or an aggressor or potential prey or potential mate, and your fellow Homo sapien collaborators, right, are moving around in your environment, relying on olfaction wouldn't be nearly as effective as vision, because photons are splashing up against them, bouncing up against your retina, your photoreceptors, and you're getting a much faster readout on changes in your environment. If you're just relying on like smelling their odors that you may or may not recognize, that's going to be very, very sluggish. So back to the article. So Jarvis notes that people started to note that they totally lost their own sense of smell very, very rapidly in some cases. But there also seem to be radical changes in their sense of smell. Not that it was lost altogether, but that certain things that used to be delicious became repulsive, which is, wild. Like something, I can't remember the specific example, but, something went from being like their favorite food to smelling like vomit, right? And so, there's some interesting prospects that Jarvis brings up, like the use of smell checks, right? Rather than like the thoroughly unsatisfying temperature checks as a rapid screening tool for COVID-19. When you walk into a place, they take your temperature. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's certainly not ideal. In terms of if you're just trying to prevent spread, right? We know there's plenty of asymptomatic spread of this virus. And so, not everybody's going to have a fever, right, when they're contagious. So, I suspect we're quite a ways away from having like a sufficiently like standardized olfactory language for something like that to work, to use like your sense of smell as like a diagnostic mechanism. But it's an interesting prospect, right? The notion that we'd have like a smell-based test rather than like a temperature check. It just seems like a world that would be more fun. Like, sir, what does this smell like? Rosemary. Okay, what does this smell like? Ginger. This, Axe body spray or something, right? That it just feels like a very like Willy Wonka-ish universe that might, and it might be justifiable. But anyway, so I found Brooke Jarvis's article to be like quite interesting, like just on its own as a piece of writing, but also because it touches on what I think is a very interesting domain of neuroscience, olfaction. A sensory system that doesn't necessarily dominate our conscious experience, but it provides some of the most interesting, some of the most memorable and emotional experiences that we can have. And so, by the way, there's this book that was written years ago now called Perfume, okay? And it was very, very popular quite a few years ago, that I think is probably like the most vivid, evocative exploration of just olfaction. I mean, obviously not just olfaction, but using olfaction as like a primary mechanism, a plot mechanism, that I've ever read, for sure. It's a little bit of a weird story, and there's a pretty strange movie that was made based on the book. This is one of those obnoxious situations where the book is definitely better than the movie, but I highly recommend the book. It's really fun. It's a fast, easy read, and it's probably going to be different than pretty much any other book you've ever read, and it's fiction. I should note. Okay, so if you're still with me and you haven't subscribed and you found this whole journey interesting, maybe you'll consider it. Otherwise, let's start the live half. Hey, Betty, good to see you. Yeah, all right, thanks for joining. So let's go live. Oh, I should remove that, and maybe I'll bring down Perfume too. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in very, very snowy Philadelphia. And on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I just talked about the olfactory system, your sense of smell, and how it is that your sense of smell can be influenced by COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, but also that you are almost certainly underestimating how important your sense of smell is. And we got into some of the anatomy, we got into some of the arguments that your olfactory system probably plays a very significant role in who you find attractive, who you choose to mate with, who you choose as your mate, and the role that the interactions, the relationships between the olfactory system and the immune system. Yes, very important. I'm a physician. Cool. Yeah. Nice jumper. What do you mean, jumper? Oh, is that like my sweater? Thank you. Thank you, Euro Maestro. That's nice of you to say. Oh, good. That's what I wanted for sure. So yeah, so it's an interesting story. There was an article that was published in the New York Times Magazine that I sort of used as kind of like a framework because, first of all, it's freely available. You can all get it, and it's not paywalled. But second of all, because it provides us sort of a good framework to explore, like, how the olfactory system works, and how it influences your consciousness in ways that I suspect you're underestimating. All right, we're getting a call. Very cool. So it looks like we are connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Hey, how are you? Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday to you. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Can you hear me? I kind of lost you there for a second.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
What's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Jim, and I'm calling from Florida.
Jim in Florida. Awesome. What's on your mind?
Well, I wanted to call, you mentioned the olfactory system and all that, the importance, and I think a lot of us are getting so focused on COVID these days and forget that loss of sense of smell and taste and all that stuff could actually be other serious things as well.
That's right, yeah.
And I've been in Florida for about 7 years. Before that, I worked in Paris for a little bit, did some physician stuff over there, and it's interesting seeing the differences in how we treat people, depending on what country you're in, actually. Europe with the universal health care and all that stuff. It's really a great system, and it's funny how they treat things completely different compared to the United States. I'm not sure if you've noticed that in your time of practice as well.
So I've never even visited France, but yeah, for sure there's obviously substantial differences. Yeah.
I feel like America, it's more about treating you to kind of get you back and follow-ups and all that stuff to get money out of insurances. And not to say that doctors are doing that. I think they've just been taught that way. And in Europe, it's kind of about nipping it and getting it over with, in a cost-efficient way.
Yeah, that's an interesting argument. I mean, certainly you wouldn't be the first person to criticize how medicine operates in the United States, where there's almost no attention paid to preventative medicine, and essentially it's always, treating the disease as it manifests. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly, and I was, I don't mean to criticize necessarily, but it's funny how because I practice in America now, and it's more of a system. You can't really break the system. It's kind of set up, and these are the rules, and you got to go by it. And if you don't, then it's not really going to work out in your favor. So it's just kind of interesting to see the two different types, and the way America does things. Like you said, it's more about treating the disease instead of really preventing it. And I think that ties into what you're talking about, because you got foods and what we drink and all that. It just kind of keeps the problem going. And I'm not a conspiracy guy at all, but it's funny. It kind of ties in with those conspiracy theorists' point of view sometimes. Making it feel like everyone's out to get them, the government and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Let me ask you, Jim. Have we spoken before?
Yeah. No, we haven't spoken before. I've seen a couple of your broadcasts, and it's always good stuff. Always thought-provoking. I saw the group chat the other day, where you had, I think, two other people in there, and that was pretty neat. How'd you do that?
It's a different platform. So it's called haps.tv. And
okay.
Yeah, so once Periscope is shuttered, everybody's looking for, a new home to be able to have these kinds of conversations. And I'm a big advocate now of Haps.
Is this going to die with Twitter, or is it going to be basically Periscope kind of a subdivision of Twitter, or where do you see it going?
Well, so Periscope is just going to be shuttered. I mean, people will still be able to go live on Twitter, but Periscope, as an independent app, will be shuttered. And so, yeah, Haps has a lot of great tools, and I highly recommend it. You can find a link to it in my profile page on Periscope.
Okay. And is it pretty much just like Periscope? You can see a map and kind of jump around? Or?
That's one thing that it's lacking, unfortunately, is it doesn't really have the same kind of discovery system. But I do know, I've talked to some of the team, that is something that they're very interested in exploring. And so hopefully eventually it'll have something like that.
People on it?
Well, certainly not as many as Periscope yet, but we shall see. In a couple weeks, maybe there'll be a significant rise. That's what I'm hoping. But yeah, Jim, listen, thanks for calling in, man. I appreciate it.
One last thing, this is great stuff, because just have people be able to just jump in and ask you questions about medical stuff. I think it's a great platform. So just want to say, keep what you're doing. And I was actually butt fucking one of my clients the other day, and so.
I knew it, dude. That guy has a voice he just sounds like Jimmy Pardo. He sounds like such a comedian from the 70s. Oh man, that was funny. Well, you got me, man. I mean, whatever. I have no problem with trolls. I enjoy a troll myself from time to time. But listen, there's some interesting conversations that Jim brought up. Jim the troll. I've definitely talked to him before. Okay, we have another caller. Oh no, you canceled. Feel free to call back in if you like. All right, the Beatles or the Stones? It depends on the mood. I'm generally speaking, I like the Rolling Stones style more. But the Beatles have some amazing songs, and it's kind of crazy to think how short-lived the Beatles as a band was and how much they produced. It's amazing. I highly recommend, though. You don't need music recommendations from me. All right, here we go. So it looks like we are connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Oh, hi, Ian. Hi. I'm calling from United Kingdom. My name is Pavitra.
Your name is, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
My name is, it's a long Indian name, so I would, you can call me Parv.
Parv, all right, awesome. Thanks for calling, Parv. What's on your mind?
Thank you. Before I put my question, I just want to give a quick remarks about the last caller.
Yeah.
I believe because in the United Kingdom, people say that from other countries that they love to see that system that in the United Kingdom as NHS, which is National Health Insurance, like it's free for everybody.
Right.
I mean, it is free for everybody, but then I recently met a mechanic, and then he said he has a prostate something like that cancer.
Sure.
And something needs to be shaved off from his bottom area. And then he said he cannot get an appointment, and approximately they say the wait is like 1 to 2 years for him to get an operation. And he has a pipe from his belly to urinate and stuff like that. I mean, it sounds good that free healthcare, but then it's actually, because my solution would be that I guess there would be a bipartisan way that both the Democrats and Republicans should agree that what was the best solution, instead of being politically correct.
Well, that certainly sounds preferable, but I think we are no longer in an era where that kind of political action is even possible. But yeah, listen, I mean, people that is like the sort of central critique of the NHS, and I'm not going to go into like politics here, that it is less efficient in some cases. But listen, in the United States, plenty of people wouldn't even have learned that they had prostate cancer because they can't afford going to the doctor to get diagnosed, right? And then even if they do get diagnosed, they can't afford the medical bills, or they're in debt for the rest of their lives, and their children are have to deal with their debt and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, no perfect solution here, but it's not a Swiss picnic over here in the United States either.
But don't you think we should demand from our MPs and our elected officials who are in the government to be held accountable for what they have done during their tenancy? Because what happens is, like, for example, with Obama and Joe Biden, just before election, they started giving speech and about how great we were. I'm like, where you were before during the whole 4 years? There's no consistency, I mean, I think we should be constantly telling them that you're working for us. It's not that we have put you on the chair just to enjoy it, that's why I think we should be demanding them in a nice and civil way. And then more serious people should join politics, not just like these people who are Nancy Pelosi. I don't what do you think on that?
Yeah. I mean, I agree. That of course we should all constantly be applying pressure to politicians. I think, generally speaking, and I actually work now as a science advisor to a state government. And so these are things about which I think deeply, but so I won't, I'll spare you all from the depth of my opinions here. But I think people make the mistake of falling in love with a politician, or considering politicians to be like friends, or personal expressions of your personal morality, when I think it's a far better way to see politicians as just tools, as blunt tools, where this politician will advocate for what I want, I support them. I don't care if I would ever have a beer with them, or if they put ketchup on their cheeseburger or whatever. I don't care about any of that stuff. It's just, is it in your best interest? Is their policy, are they dependent upon getting the votes of people who share your interests? And if so, support them. Yeah, anyways, I mean, but listen, fundamentally I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think politicians exclusively respond to pressure from their constituents. And so, yeah, man, I totally agree.
People have seen during the Trump presidency that he was doing these changes, which were beneficial for the people, like Keystone Pipeline in Wisconsin. Now the people are realizing they have, what they have actually done now. Because I understand Democrats want to go towards green future, they want to bring green jobs, but they don't have green jobs at the moment, and they have killed oil and gas jobs. So I'm like, you don't have an alternative for these people, but then you have killed their main jobs. I mean, you say you want unity and but I think there is a lack of responsibility in politicians. I mean, they themselves think that people forget about us once they elect us. I guess I would come back to the point that obviously we should constantly remind them that you are there in the office for a reason. It's not just to enjoy your life. Because Donald Trump was living a happy life, he was already a billionaire, millionaire. People don't realize this thing, that they think whatever. But
well,
yeah,
I mean,
I'll have my call and then I'll keep listening to you.
okay. I mean, yeah, we could go on and on, but listen, thanks for calling. These are interesting and important topics. Yeah. Listen, I think that there should be more scientists in elected office. Like you could fit basically, as of like 2018, you could fit basically all elected scientists to elected federal office that were in office in my apartment, in my Philadelphia apartment. Like literally you could do that. So yeah, I want more scientists in elected office. So we are now speaking with the illustrious Euromaestro, with whom I chatted a couple days ago. So Euro in Europe. What's on your mind, man?
Well, I wasn't going to call in, but after the last two calls, I feel almost obligated to. So as far as elected scientists go, good news is, we have an elected scientist over here, and who leads up Germany and has done a really relatively good job on COVID-19. But in terms of these healthcare systems, I think what happens is people always have anecdotal examples in wherever they live because they've heard about some bad experience. But when you look at comparative studies that compare different systems in countries, we get pretty much the same results all the time, which is that these systems are far superior, more efficient, more cost-effective, but also produce better results. Mm-hmm. And one of the examples I like to cite is sort of the difference between the U.S. and Canada. So Canada used to have a system very similar to the United States just a few decades ago. And when they did have that system, their costs were similar to the Americans, and their overall results were slightly worse than the Americans. Since then, they switched to their current system, and now their costs are roughly half that of the United States, but the results are far superior. And the same thing if you look at European healthcare results, universally, rated is far superior. So you get better outcomes, and our costs are significantly cheaper. Mm-hmm. So usually the U.S. is spending somewhere around twice as much on a per capita basis than Europeans. Even the French system, which may be a little bit more expensive, the Americans are about 50% higher. But the Europeans have much better results. So I think, I think it's, one can easily be, misled by your own, personal dissatisfaction with services, which I'm sure we all have.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the U.S. system is probably superior for people who are affluent, right? That you can just get.
I'm talking about, the overall.
Yeah, no, of course, I totally understand. Yeah, it's more effective for more people, right? European and Canadian systems. Yeah, completely. Yeah, thanks for making that point. I mean, how I feel about these these issues, but it's not generally a topic that I discuss in depth. But so I appreciate you doing so.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we don't have any movements in the world anywhere where they've switched to these systems where people are yearning to switch back. So,
Indeed.
If it was as bad as these critics were trying to play, there would be people saying, hey, let's do something else,
Indeed.
If anything, the push is always towards more of it. And, I can't imagine how good our results were if we were to spend as much as the U.S., if we doubled our healthcare expenses, it would be an amazing thing. But
Indeed, I mean, and even simple things like having the government be able to negotiate drug prices, that would be kind of nice. That is essentially one of the main reasons that drugs are so expensive here, and there's a bunch of nonsense justifications that people will put out there, but yeah. Anyways, was there anything else?
It's not necessarily even a right-left issue.
No.
You saw Trump Trump was even advocating for, negotiating drug prices and other measures to bring drug prices
Indeed,
down.
yeah. It is so much more popular. Like, I personally, I don't really care about unity, like political unity. I don't think it's particularly useful, and it has never existed, I don't think, in this country. But these some of these priorities that are, they're not partisan, like they're wildly popular. So if you want unity, you should pass those policies. But anyways, what else is on your mind?
Well, that's it. Well, just thank you very much. I'm really glad you're doing these broadcasts. I don't know if you wanted an olfactory system question, but I posted one.
Oh, you did? Okay.
In case you do.
What, ketchup on a cheeseburger?
But you can feel free to ignore it, because I was just throwing it out there.
Okay, yeah, I got you. Okay.
Have a question on your topic. But I said, why do most mammals have two distinct and segregated olfactory systems, but not humans?
So you mean like the vomeronasal structure versus like olfactory bulb?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting. I mean, so, it's not that humans that it's completely absent from human anatomy. It's just essentially vestigial. I mean, there are some scientists, and I've talked about this on the podcast that I've linked below on the YouTube, that, there are some scientists who argue that actually, no, it is functional. And there have been, some like, there's plenty of like behavioral studies that people will use to argue that, like, yeah, actually we are sensitive to pheromones, and we are sensitive to, these subtle olfactory signals. And there's even some electrophysiological research showing that something happens, right? That system is not completely vestigial, but generally speaking, I think that, so the whole argument I just made on YouTube is that the olfactory system is far more robust and comprehensive in the human brain, human nervous system, than we all sort of popularly appreciate. And part of the explanation is that Paul Broca, of Broca's Areas fame, essentially described the attenuation of the importance of the olfactory system in favor of the emergence of free will, because his whole anatomical framework was that as the frontal lobes in the human brain began to get bigger, and that's obviously true, the olfactory bulb, which, if you look in like a rodent or something like that, it's almost like a fourth their entire brain. It's huge, and it's right in the front. And in the human brain, the olfactory bulb has sort of evolved to be, ventral or underneath the frontal lobe. So the sort of philosophical almost argument that Paul Broca made, at the behest of French bishops, evidently, in the Senate. But anyways, was that, human free will emerged at the cost of our olfactory system. And essentially ever since then, the olfactory system has been portrayed as this sort of like lesser sense, and even associated with like lesser organisms, right? That we sort of transcended this primitive anatomy to have, more important brain regions like the frontal lobes. But also, I think evolutionarily, like, it's justifiable, right? The olfactory system is very important. It's very useful. It influences things like mate selection, like, your ability to determine how closely related somebody is. But it's also a very sluggish sensory system relative to vision, right? Vision is the dominant sensory system in the human brain, and that makes sense because, photons move a lot more quickly, literally at the speed of light, compared to, molecules floating through the air, which move rather slowly in comparison. So you have a much better, more up-to-date, status report on your environment. And so, just evolutionarily, I would imagine that, primates in general, but then also humans, just the primates that evolved to rely more on vision just tended to have a reproductive advantage. And, anatomically, the frontal lobe, it did indeed, expand, and things do have to move and compensate for that change in anatomical sort of real estate. And so that's ultimately why I think that, that essentially almost every other meaningful, macrofauna, animal, including primates, have, far greater emphasis on, olfactory processing than humans do. But that is not to say that the olfactory system is useless or, barely important to human consciousness. I think it's much more important to human consciousness than I think even in the sciences we widely appreciate. So what do you think?
I think you said it much better than I could have ever imagined trying to state it. But yeah, I think that's great. I do have one last question, because I see you have a whole bunch of questions in the chat, which is your YouTube channel sounds fascinating. How can we go about subscribing to it?
Why, thank you for asking, my friend. So it is youtube.com/anthropoid, but just to make it easy, I have a link in my Periscope profile page that you can just tap, and it should bring you there.
Well, sounds great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Euro. Talk to you soon. Euromaestro, everybody. Oh, by the way, so Euromaestro, sort of an OG Periscope streamer. He sort of started focused on culture and sort of covering society and history and stuff like that. But then upon the emergence of COVID-19, he rapidly applied his expertise to tracking and responding and communicating as COVID-19 evolved. So you can check him out on Twitter. That's where I generally interact with him. But he's also on haps.tv. So, okay. Let's see. So here, I'll go back a bit. So, so why don't we like to watch animals suffer? Why is it different with people? Huh. Interesting. Why is it different with people? Oh, like why do humans enjoy watching people suffer? Well, I think by and large they don't. I mean, by and large, there's an aversion, right? There is an empathetic experience of literally it's like the same brain regions that are associated with like revulsion, like when you're exposed to like the smell of vomit or things that are rotten food, right? The insular cortex responds, and it's a very, very powerful motivator for the human experience, human behavior, because again, if you think about it evolutionarily, eating some food that it has the prospect of infecting you, or filled with parasites, or is rotten, that is a very, very easy way for a primitive Homo sapien to die, right? It's not like they had antibiotics or antiviral vaccines, certainly not. But they had no doctor, so if you ate something that was potentially life-threatening, it's not like you could pump your stomach, right? We do have a primitive stomach pumping system, though. It's called the chemo receptor. No, what is it? Oh, jeez. The God, what is it? It's like the receptor trigger zone or something like that. Anyways, it's part of the brain that essentially monitors for the presence of levels of molecules that fluctuate through the blood. And so, for example, when somebody ingests large amounts of alcohol, part of the area postrema is sort of like is a part of this system. It's a brain region called the area postrema, but part of that vomit reflex that people have when they drink too much, or when they ingest high doses of opioids that are high enough. There are receptors literally in that part of the brain that are monitoring for those levels in the blood, and when they detect something that is at a concentration sufficient, it begins, and you cannot stop it, a vomit reflex. Not all animals have a vomit reflex, by the way. But anyway, so that is our primitive stomach pumping system, but it's not like going to the hospital and having your stomach pumped and then filled with charcoal, right? And so having a system that would very, very effectively motivate a human to avoid consuming a food or, whatever it might be, evolutionarily very, very important. So, except cocaine. Brain always needs more cocaine. Yeah, and so that same brain region, I mean, the main region that most people in my position would talk about with regards to this topic would be the insular cortex, that disgust reaction, very, very powerfully motivated. That is also motivating. That is also activated when you observe somebody, when you observe somebody certainly being injured or hurt, but also when you observe, what you would consider to be like morally or ethically unjustified treatment. Like when you see somebody being cheated in, whatever mechanism. It doesn't have to be like cheated on in a relationship or anything like that. Just in general unfairness, a lack of justice can activate that same brain region, and so there is that reaction. Now, I mean, I don't know, you might be referring to like why we enjoy watching sort of theatrical depictions of people being injured. I think that people being hurt. I think that's an interesting conversation, and frankly, I suspect that a psychologist would provide a more nutritious response to this. But I think just the knowledge that this is not real, I think that is a gigantic factor. And I can't remember where I had this conversation, but it was with a scientist talking about the neurobiology of humor, like why we find things funny. And obviously there's a lot of things that people find funny. People have different senses of humor and all that kind of stuff, right? Stipulating all that variability. One of the models is that it's benign transgression, right? So in other words, when you see somebody breaking the rules or saying something that you would never be comfortable saying in public, like the Larry David type of comedy, but and so he's transgressing, he's saying absurd things, offensive things, but it's safe. He doesn't mean it in a abusive way, or he just doesn't mean it at all. It's just being funny, right? It's that benign component to it is is what enables the laughter, right? Or what promotes the laughter, because it's absurd, right? I suspect that there's a similar type of component to observing, like watching John Wick or something like that, where dozens and dozens of people are dying. I suspect that there's a similar component there. A friend of mine who I don't know if he completed his PhD in philosophy in London. I can't remember which institution. Really, really difficult to get a PhD in philosophy in general, but certainly in a lot of those august UK institutions. His argument was that it is just rehearsal. It's emotional rehearsal. So, which I found kind of fascinating, like that, we have this whole repertoire of emotions available to us, and only rarely do we explore some of them in our natural lives, right? But if you can sympathize with a character, I was playing Lord of the Rings in the background last night while I was reading, and you sympathize with these characters, they're fighting so hard, they're so loyal to each other, they're blah blah blah, like all of those things. I'm probably not going to be fighting a whole sea of orcs anytime in my life, and so I'm never going to experience that emotion, but you can sort of rehearse it. You can kind of experience a little bit of it, and that was his argument. I don't know how true that is, but it's at least fascinating. Okay. Oh, Villani in France. I'm not familiar with Villani. Yeah, we definitely have some elected scientists in office, and in fact, in 2018, I think something like 12 were elected, the greatest number of all time. I'm pretty sure. We just need to avoid policies based on science denial. That's where the urgency is, I think. Yeah, I think that's certainly... You're not going to find somebody disagreeing with you here. No argument there. Okay. So the doctors diagnosed a brain lining tumor because of her smelling things that weren't there in my mother. Very interesting. I'm sorry to hear that, of course. Yeah, that is a fascinating... It's something that I've wanted to explore in the past. I just haven't really jumped into this literature. Is we have all kinds of we can hallucinate in a bunch of different ways, right? We can, obviously, visual hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there, having distorted sensory experiences. There's auditory hallucinations, which are far more common than visual hallucinations, believe it or not. In psychosis or in schizophrenia. But there have to be olfactory hallucinations, and there are olfactory hallucinations when somebody has a stroke, for example, or when people have epilepsy, seizures. But it would be an interesting. You know what the closest experience is to that? And sorry, Javier, I'll be done in like one second. There's a substance called miracleberry. Okay, if you've never tried miracleberry, I highly, highly recommend it. It is like one of the weirdest ways to sort of feel the contours of your sensory systems. It causes it's like a little chewable thing. Coat your tongue, and then it causes your taste experience to be completely radically different. Like lemons and limes will just taste like a starburst, like deliciously sweet. Seltzer water will taste very different. At least that was my experience. Bell peppers, things that are not, delicious in the way that like candy is delicious, will taste like candy. It is so weird. So highly recommend. You can get on Amazon, but it is a hallucinatory experience essentially. But anyway, so Javier, in London, if I remember correctly, what's on your mind?
I have a question again. I don't know if it's totally unrelated. In the case of olfaction, what are the names of the neurons involved in like the last stage before the sensation is experienced?
In the last stage, so I mean, ultimately there's an olfactory cortex, and I don't. So one way to think about it is that we have neurons in the brain that receive signaling from what are called glomeruli, and they essentially, you have, different animals have different setups here, but you have a certain number of olfactory receptors that will send information to what's called a glomerulus, and then that structure will send signals to an olfactory cortex, just like the visual cortex, or whatever, a dedicated group of neurons, and they just be called neurons. But what's interesting about that anatomy, and I actually didn't know this until I was doing some background reading for the YouTube video today. So mice have a fantastic olfactory system, right? And they're driven by olfaction rather than vision, right? That's our dominant sense. Humans, of course, are principally driven by our visual experience, right? But it turns out that that one odor receptor in the mouth, and I'm doing this from memory, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little hazy on the details, but one odor receptor is serviced, or it's like, shoot, the resolution. So it's one odor receptor influences the activity of something like just 2 glomeruli in the mouse brain, right? Whereas one odor receptor can influence the activities of 16 glomeruli in the human brain, suggesting that in some cases we may be superior in our ability to distinguish certain olfactory experiences. And while we don't necessarily have as robust, and we can compare it to like a dog, for example, right? Dogs are well known for their ability to discriminate odor, and one of the scientists, I believe his name was McGann, his argument is that like dogs may be better than us at discriminating the urine of different animals on a fire hydrant, right? But humans may be better at discriminating the different flavor notes in like red wine, right? That it's not a function of just one is much better than the other. It's rather context dependent. So anyways, that was a whole tangent that you probably weren't interested in, but that's essentially it. You have olfactory receptors that are on olfactory nerves that extend from the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is essentially part of the brain. It's on the bottom surface of the brain. And then glomeruli receive that information, send it to neurons in what would be like an olfactory cortex.
Yeah. And the difficult question, those neurons in the final stage, how do they go about producing a sensation?
How do they go about producing a sensation? Well, I mean,
because working at the physical level, I'm just curious as to how that switches levels to a kind of mental experiential level.
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately you're using this to ask the binding question, right? Yeah. So I mean, the frustrating answer would be that they do so in the frequencies of their action potential firing, right? Just like the same way that neurons that underlie memory, that underlie emotion, that underlie other sensory systems, they encode those signals in frequencies, essentially. And so, like that is literally the answer. But I know I suspect that that's not going to be a satisfying answer for you. And so, I mean, ultimately the question comes down to whether or not you accept that the activities of neurons determine the trajectory of consciousness or the nature of consciousness. If you don't accept that, or if you think that, there's not enough evidence to suggest that when a neuron fires an impulse or fires a certain frequency of impulses, of action potentials, that has a direct one-to-one relationship with the, changes in consciousness. If you don't accept that, then that answer is not going to be satisfying. But that is fundamentally the answer.
When you say the neuron firing, do you just mean that it's putting through a neurotransmitter, or do you mean it's doing something else?
No, so it can involve neurotransmitters, but basically neurons are what are called excitable cells. So what that means is that they have the ability to what it literally means is that they have the ability to literally rapidly induce a change in concentration of ions, right, charged atoms, sodium, potassium, calcium, right, and so on. And so an action potential and that rapid movement of ions is associated with a change in what's called membrane potential. So it's essentially like current, right, like electrical current, right? So neurons are capable of responding to various stimuli, which can include neurotransmitters, it can include other things, by generating rapid changes in electrical processes, right, in what's called membrane potential. So that's it, right? Neurotransmitters can cause those, that firing to happen, that firing of impulses, firing of action potentials to happen. Certain neurotransmitters will make it more likely that they'll fire impulses. Others will make it less likely. But that's what we mean, is that there's this rapid change in electrical activity at the site of that neuron that can then influence the same of other neurons.
The firing that you mentioned, so in the case of olfaction, do you mean that it would be a certain frequency versus, for example, neurons that are involved in memory, so that maybe the frequency between the two in firing is different, and that's kind of what makes the two mental kind of operations different?
Right, yeah, I mean, I get the point that you're making. So yes, the distinction will be in whether or not, let's just get a little bit more tangible, right? A neuron can be silent, it can just be sitting there. When you are, and let's just, let's focus on vision, because I think it's a little bit more intuitive. So, right now, if you close your eyes, a lot of the neurons in your occipital cortex, right, in your visual cortex, will be sort of not completely silent, but activity will go down, right? And then you open your eyes and you're looking at a device, and there's probably all kinds of blue light coming at you, some yellow light, blah, blah, blah. Certain photoreceptors then cause those neurons to all of a sudden wake up, and then they begin firing. They went from, let's say, 2 times a second, right, to 25 times a second, right? So it goes from like do 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 to brr, brr. And so that change in that frequency, literally the change in frequency, is the signal, is the change in the state of the neuron that determines how the rest of the brain will receive its information. And so when you say it's not necessarily that because this neuron is capable of firing at 20 times a second, and then that neuron, which is involved in memory, it can only fire at 15 times a second, or it can go to 80 times a second. That distinction is not what distinguishes their contributions to consciousness. Rather, what determines that is the connectivity of that specific neuron. So this neuron, it's receiving information exclusively from olfactory receptors, let's just say, right? This neuron in the olfactory cortex. It's only getting information from olfactory receptors. So of all of the 86 billion neurons in the brain, this one is an expert on whether or not you're exposed to, some funky brie cheese or something, right? And it only sends connections to specific parts of the brain, not the entire brain, but it only will send connections to emotional parts of the brain, to parts of the brain that are associated with memory, right? And so those neurons also only receive information from sensory neurons. And so it is because of that difference in connectivity that will determine how a neuron contributes to our sensory experiences, our memories, our cognition, right? So it's all about the circuit, the nature of the circuit.
The information, it's usually transferred by chemical means, or is it by some other means?
It's electrochemical, right? So the chemical component of electrochemical refers to neurotransmitters, hormones, signaling molecules like that. So, chemical. Electro is the impulse, is that rapid change in electrical activity. So that's literally the language of neurons, is electrochemical. And so so the chemical signaling is far slower than the electrical signaling, but the chemical signaling can influence the electrical signaling, right? In all those ways that I was describing before. So it's a combination of both.
Do you mean that it's the chemical signaling? Because in the case of olfaction, there's the compound, I don't know, phenylethanol, responsible for the scent of rose. It's actually it's chemical that distinguishes the the mental operation.
Absolutely. Yes. I thought you were talking more about what distinguishes or how neurons operate. Yeah, it's entirely chemical. So it is literally molecules. And I talked about this on the YouTube video, youtube.com/anthropoid for anybody that's interested. I talked about this anatomy in a little bit greater depth. But yeah, literally there are molecules floating around in the air, right? Literally suspended in the air. And some of them, we sample some of them by smelling them, bringing them up into our nasal cavity, and then they literally bind odor receptors, olfactory receptors, that extend from the olfactory bulb. And, the olfactory system is one of the most dynamic. It's constantly changing. And so literally there is a receptor binding event that is then received as, we detected it. We detected rose, or what is the other, there's a specific molecule where as you add amino groups, or nitrogen, it smells more and more like rotting fish. I think it's like I can't remember. It's very funny. I smelled something like before. But anyways,
I'm not sure, but I think dimethyl sulfide smells maybe quite similar to that. I was thinking rotting eggs.
Rotting eggs. Yeah, correct. Yeah, so I think it's actually, what's funny about it is that this molecule I'm talking about that smells like fish can be used in the manufacture of methamphetamine. And so yeah, so it can be kind of stanky in those labs. But anyways, yeah, so that is exclusively chemical. And so to make this tangible, when you walk into a bakery and somebody's baking sourdough bread, you're literally smelling, ingesting molecules of that sourdough bread, and that's how you sample your environment, right? And that also makes it a rather slow sensory system relative to vision, because of course those molecules are just traveling at the speed of molecules traveling through air, whereas vision is dependent upon photons that travel at the speed of light, and so it's far faster. But it is a very, very simple sensory system, right? Literally, it's chemoreception. It's having molecules binding receptors, and it's probably the most ancient evolutionary system, because it is we evolved from organisms that were pretty much just floating around in water. And so they had a chemoreception, a primitive olfactory system from which we evolved. Now, once we got out of the water, then, the olfactory system adapted. I say we, our primitive evolutionary ancestors. But yeah, so it is very, very ancient. It has very unique anatomy relative to other sensory systems. But yes, sorry for my misunderstanding. It is exclusively chemical.
Yeah, no, that makes sense then. Yeah. Okay. Well, I had a question. Why do you feel that, as you said, some people may have an issue with thinking of these receptors as kind of it not being a sufficient explanation to say, oh, well, these physical operations lead to, subjective experience, that you have to accept something. If it's the case of just accepting it, why are so many people almost feeling intuitively that doesn't quite make the explanation good enough? It isn't just obvious that that's the answer. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, I think it is, but I think part of it is that we are primates, right? There is no law in nature that scientific discoveries have to be intuitive, right? Talk to me about how intuitive is quantum mechanics, right? It's so foreign from relative to our day-to-day experience, certainly relative to the environment in which we evolved, right? We don't interact with physics at that domain, and so it is not very intuitive, and nor should it be expected to be intuitive, right? And so when it comes to neuroscience and consciousness, I think the same thing is operative here, is that we don't interrogate, cellular biology, right? We have no relationship with it. We never interact with it intuitively, meaning like we don't poke and see and feel, and because we didn't have to, right? To evolve for reproductive success, it didn't matter, right? We had systems doing that for us subconsciously, like the olfactory system, right? And so, I think that there is just this gap, this like chasm that separates what is intuitive to somebody who has not spent years, studying these systems, seeing similar types of dynamics at different components of consciousness, and then sort of just accepting. No, it's just these cells behave in specific ways under certain circumstances, and they influence other cells throughout the brain that then do the same. And out of all of that collaboration emerges consciousness. And depending upon the organization that you can have the consciousness of a bat, or of a cat, or of a human, right? I think that's why.
I mean, I'll agree that those that are more learned and aware of the information in that field, for example, quantum mechanics, that they'll have more information in the field. But despite having all that information, I imagine most people who work in that field would still say it's not intuitive.
Yeah, it's totally not. I mean, who was it? Richard Feynman, who said anybody who tells you they understand quantum mechanics is either lying or wrong. Like, yeah, that's correct. It is weird. Like don't get me. Part of why I think it's so interesting is that it's so strange that a system like this would have emerged, right? And then from but of course the evolutionary biologist in me, and and a lot of of my colleagues would say something like this was probably always going to emerge, right? Like given the circumstances, given the environment on Earth, given the recipes that were available at the time back then, right? Something like this, a form of animal behavior that is so comprehensive and capable, so versatile, was likely to emerge. Didn't have to emerge, but it was likely to emerge. So yeah, like it's still weird to me, don't get me wrong, but that's part of why I think it's so beautiful and so interesting.
Right. I'll admit, the more information I find out about neurons and what they do, and then kind of like how that correlates with conscious activity,
mm-hmm.
It still baffles me. For me, it is far from intuitive. We can learn more about the correlates. The more we learn, I feel like not a single step forward is made in kind of establishing that connection.
Well, wait, what connection?
Yeah. Well, the connection in explaining the how, how you go from that physical to that mental, how you make that leap.
Well,
what is it about a physical system that can affect a system that's operating on a totally different level?
But that's your assumption, that it's operating on a different level. Why is that the case? What evidence is there for that?
So, I mean, what
taste of your own medicine, huh, Javier?
No, I mean, like, what a neuron does, and a chemical like phenylethanol or whatever chemical, it's totally different from the sensation considered abstractly.
But why?
The sensation.
What rule? For what reason should we consider it abstractly?
It's just the way we experience, right? Reality.
I suppose. It doesn't mean that that's the way reality operates, though. Anyways, all right, Javier. As always, you've brought some of the most interesting conversations to the table. As always, hey man, I hope you'll check out haps.tv. It's the platform where a lot of folks are sort of going to be migrating, and because it would be my loss if we didn't get to continue chatting. So hopefully I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks. You sent me a video on Twitter, the Daniel Dennett one.
Yeah, a while ago.
Some of it, but I had a lot of stuff on my mind. I've been exploring lots of other topics. I'll make some effort to watch it this week and maybe get back to you on it.
Sounds good. It's a date. Talk to you then.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. So somebody just asked, what is it called? It's haps.tv, HAPPS.tv. I have a link to it in my on my profile page. So I have a link to my YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, where I talk about a specific topic to some length or at some length. And then I also have a link to the other platform that I'm talking about. It has a lot of other tools available, a lot more sophisticated platform than even Periscope is. And it's a really, part of the reason that I like it, and then I'll stop about it, is they have a good philosophy about how content should exist and be promoted on the internet. Thanks, sir. I appreciate that, man. Okay, let me go back. Oh, speaking of YouTube, I should probably check to see. Okay, it's all copacetic over here. It's all good. Okay, that's what I thought, because it's nearly impossible to pick up a scent from a whiff of air. Also reptiles. Oh wait, I'm okay. Are humans driven more by survival or by reward? Very interesting topic. You still in Philly? And yes, I'm in very snowy Philly. I think it's gonna be snowing for like 3 days. Are we driven more by survival or by reward? That's a very interesting way to frame that topic. My response would be yes. My response would be that the reason that we experience reward is because it is a way to navigate threats to our survival. Threats to our survival in the form of a lack of nutrition, threats to our survival in terms of a lack of social cohesion, social collaboration, and threats to our reproductive success, right? Meaning like if part of the reward of reproducing is the reason we experience orgasms is because it incentivizes reproduction, right? And that's reward. Isn't survival rewarding? Oh, good to see you, Crooked. Yeah, indeed, right? But if we evolved in such an environment where it didn't really, you would just exist and there's no real way to influence your survival likelihoods, or you didn't really have to reproduce, we probably wouldn't have such robust emotional experiences. But because of the versatility of humanity and the primates from which we evolved and all the environments in which they were evolving, we need some kind of rudder, some kind of mechanism, some tool for us to use to determine whether or not we should engage in any given behavior. And in our primitive, early stages of primate evolution, right? That should I eat this berry? Should I reproduce with this other primate? Should I attack this other group of primates? Should I attack the alpha male or whatever? The determination was not made based off of like a Spock, like, Vulcan, like purely emotionless, rational, like it is time for me to attack that other primate because I am now bigger than he is, and I can kill him, and then I can prevent him from reproducing. It's not like those are the decisions that were being made by our primitive, primate ancestors. Rather, it was just they experienced aggression, right? And they at a certain point, the aggression is sufficient that they actually outwardly attack, right? And then the same goes for reproduction, where it's not like you're sitting there, although I did sort of do this a little bit, but like it's not like you're sitting there like, this is an ideal mate. Her genetics are compatible in ways that I suspect are going to be optimal for my offspring. She has a very good bone structure. She's smart. It's not like those are the determinations that humans make. Certainly, just when they're rehearsing reproduction, but reproducing as well. It's based out of love, right? You love this person, and that love is an emotional experience for sure. And she had optimal booty. Exactly. Yeah, you're speaking my language. It's that, that love, though, is based off of survival, right? It's based off of evolution, off of evolutionary decisions. So, we don't all use spreadsheets to do all that calculus. Yeah, right, exactly. Hi from the UK. Why does the AstraZeneca vaccine give you a headache? Interesting topic. In Euromeister, please, weigh in if you feel that I'm wrong here, but it's because you're having an immune system reaction. Your immune system is responding to the vaccine by first having an innate immune reaction, meaning like just as though you're exposed to a pathogen, your innate immune system, this is an immune system that isn't B cells and T cells. They're just cells that'll just attack anything. that is different, that is foreign. And sometimes they attack things that are not foreign. But anyways, and we experience that in the form of fever, in the form of achiness, in the form of headaches, and then ultimately we form, we generate a secondary immunity where, where we have B cells and T cells, and antibodies are produced, and so on, right? And so like the only reason that you ever know that you're sick is because your immune system is reacting, right? I mean, not the singular only reason, but the main reason. The reason you have a headache when you catch a cold, maybe from a different coronavirus, or you catch the flu, all of that is due to the inflammatory response of the immune system. And so that's why. And listen, it's not only the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a virus actually. It's a modified adenovirus, a chimpanzee adenovirus called ChAdOx. It's the Chad vaccine. But you can have that. You will likely, in some cases, have the similar reaction to who is this guy? Let's just do that. I haven't done that in a million years. Ian, who's this clown? I have no idea. I don't really care. And I hope you don't care either. Don't devote any neuronal activity to whatever that nonsense was. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines will also induce an immune response. I mean, that's the only reason they work, is that they induce an immune response. It tends to be, people have different reactions, different levels of severity. And so that is the point being, that is absolutely nothing to be concerned about. And frankly, it's a reasonably good sign that your immune system is responding, that you are going to be generating antibodies to successfully prevent severe reactions to COVID-19. Not necessarily to prevent infection, although it probably helps, but to prevent you from having to go to the hospital and being put on a ventilator, right? So that's why. So no concern. And congratulations, by the way, if you got the vaccine. My parents got their first vaccines. Not the Oxford AstraZeneca, but the Moderna one. And I couldn't be happier. There's a podcast by a guy named Michael Osterholm. He's a leading epidemiologist in the United States. His most recent episode is good. He talks about this, about how emotional the reaction was to his reaction to getting the vaccine. Because he knows, right? And you all should appreciate as well that this is going to change our lives for the better. And we're all very, very fortunate that brilliant scientists, accomplish this so rapidly. Okay, Duke, it looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Brother? How are you?
Not bad. How are you?
Good, man. Always good to see your face on here. I'm spreading wonderful information and knowledge and wisdom, and I love it, man. I love your energy.
I appreciate that. Thanks for saying so. What's your name and where are you calling from?
So, I'm here in South Carolina. This is Duke. I called in a while back.
Okay.
Talking about lucid dreaming and
cool. Yeah.
Stuff. But I had another question randomly. I had a thought. When you're trying to think of something, like you're trying to think of someone's name, and you can't quite grab the memory yet. You're like, oh my God, I know it. What is their name? What is their name? And then you can't quite remember it. So then you go about your business. You're like, oh, I'm sure it'll come to me later. I'm sure it'll show up later. So you go about your business. Maybe you're cooking or something, or washing dishes or something like that. And 2-3 hours later, bam, there's a part of your brain that's like, oh, excuse me, here it is. I found the memory. Here you go. And you're like, oh shit, Carol was her name. Carol was, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot. What is that phenomenon of seemingly looking for a memory or a certain area of a neural connection, and then you go about your conscious business, but subconsciously there's this mechanism that just searching for it while you do seeming you, or you would call yourself, does your
did we lose you?
And reminds you, hey, here it is. What is that phenomenon?
I love it. This is a great topic. So as some people have noted in the chat, that is sometimes called tip of the tongue syndrome. It also can be referred to as presque-vu. But in any case, I think it's presque-vu. But in any case, basically what's happening here, at least part of what's happening here, is you have no. There is a system with which you have no interaction that determines essentially the next thing you're going to think about. A memory that's going to be elicited by some word I say pizza, and you think about the last time you got pizza or something. As well as the specific words that you're going to be saying next. Like, I have no idea what the next word that I'm going to say is going to be. It just sort of happens, right? And I can influence that in certain ways, but broadly speaking, that is a fully subconscious process. And so how does that system work? Let's just focus specifically on language, because that's what you brought up, right? Can't remember her name is Carol. And maybe sometimes you're like, I can only think that her name is, whatever. What's another Carol like name? Denise. I can only think of Denise. I know it's not Denise, but that's the only thing that my brain is serving up to me.
You can see her face and everything. You're like, she's there. Why didn't I store the name right next to the memory of where I stored the features of her face?
Love it. Yeah. I mean, so first of all, you're exactly right. I mean, those memories are completely, anatomically distinct areas.
Yeah.
But so basically, part of the way that this system works is that I've learned a set of words, right, in my life, and they're all available to me to say, right. And at any one moment, one word is going to be superior to another to express a thought or dredge up a memory of somebody's name. And so what happens is that all of these options, these word options, are available to you. And what the brain does is, rather than activating one, activating like, the Carol word, it inhibits all of the other options, right? And so if for whatever reason, this system, I think the anterior cingulate cortex is particularly central to this process. If for whatever reason, this brain region focuses in on the wrong word, right? It's almost right, but it's the wrong one, and it's wrong. The problem is that brain region is still inhibiting all of the other options that includes the correct one. And it's very difficult to remove that inhibition, because again, it's a completely subconscious process. It's, you have no control over it. And then once some time passes, you're doing the dishes, you're taking a shower, whatever, you're in a completely different mind space. You're not thinking about whatever it was you were thinking about. That inhibition is released. And so all of a sudden, Carol is available to you now because it's not being inhibited by the brain. So that's
interesting.
That's also, by the way, I mean, that's how the motor system works to a certain extent, where there's a bunch of different movements that I could be engaging in right now, but it's sort of it's this wacky system where it's a combination of activating what I want and then inhibiting essentially everything else that I could be doing. And here's an interesting example. So, how does the brain signal for me to do this, for me to point one finger, right? You would think it would just be, there's a set of finger neurons up here that send signals down through my spinal cord, out through the muscles that control this finger, and then voila, I'm moving my finger. Actually, what happens is that the brain sends a signal down through the spinal cord, to the spinal cord, that basically says, move all your fingers, okay? And then all of the fingers that you don't want to move are inhibited. And so it's like this completely messy, ridiculous system, but it's the one that evolved. Yeah, isn't that weird? And so in any case, yeah, similar type of process.
But it all happens so fast. It's like when you're about to fall, you don't, on the way down, say, okay, I got to pull this muscle,
Yes.
and this muscle, and this muscle, and then it'll pull out my hand, and my hand will reach for the ground and catch me, and then I got to pull this other muscle so my leg can go out. Like, it just instantly does it. Now, with the question I asked, what is that knowing, say, okay, so it inhibits all these other things, and it brings up this name that isn't correct, but I know that it's not correct. So if I know that it's not correct, why would whomever, if you want to even call it whomever or whatever it is, what would make that portion of me believe it's correct and pull that out to display to the other part of me that is, I guess, the conscious part of me that knows it's not? So it's like, almost like a part of me thinks it is, but then the real part of me knows it is. It's so strange. It's like, it almost makes me want to dive into the mystery of like consciousness. Like, what the fuck are we? Who are we? What is going on? Are these two different entities like talking to each other? I mean,
Yeah, I think. Listen, yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, yeah, it's endlessly fascinating to me, and there are multiple, manifestations of this. Like, I studied addiction, right? I studied the neurobiology of addiction, and there's a bunch of different reasons that I wanted to study it, but part of it is because it is a thoroughly irrational state where somebody is just imprisoned by a different system than their rational thought, right? In other words, somebody is addicted to heroin. Generally speaking, people don't like to be addicted to heroin, right? They would rather not be addicted to heroin. And
they remember learning when they were kids it was bad, but they did it anyway.
Sure, and they're also, day to day, they're getting sick, they hate it, they spend so much time having to go and find some heroin, and it's expensive, and their social opportunities are limited as a result, right? Their rational mind, and people try and kick habits. Same with smoking, right? People try and kick these habits. They know they want to quit. They know it's bad for their well-being, but they do it anyways, right? So what's that about? And so it's a similar type of fundamental property here, and that is that these systems, first of all, your conscious awareness, right? If you think about human consciousness, think about an iceberg, right? Where, you can see a part of the iceberg that's sticking out of the water, but because of physics, the bottom part of the iceberg that's submerged is significantly larger. That is sort of the relationship between conscious awareness and your subconscious or your unconscious. Far more of the brain is devoted to unconscious, subconscious processes with which you have no interaction, right? You cannot, they're just not a part of the network of neurons that encodes your conscious awareness. And so as a result, there's no way for you to consciously interrogate any of this, right? It's just happening under the hood of the car, and you just know that when you press the gas pedal, you go, but you have no, you're not influencing anything that's going on under the hood. And so similar process. So one system makes an error, right? Humans are very error prone, but the other system recognizes that there's an error, but it has no mechanism by which to correct that error other than to just focus on something else, let this error fade into the background, and then the correct choice can be made.
Interesting. So is it possible at all to make that part of the system part of your conscious system? Because what I do with lucid dreaming, when seemingly most people dream, one would call it, their subconscious that they're immersed in, and, usually while they're there in the moment that they're within the dream and their body's asleep, they don't realize that they're dreaming. But there is also, because I know I study it, there is a way to train your mind with meditation and journaling and stuff to tap into that subconscious part of yourself and explore it. And what seemingly was just created by its own, by the subconscious volition of desire, suddenly you can take the reins of and start controlling it and designing it in the way you want from a conscious perspective. So it's like conscious within the subconscious, woken up to eliminate the subconscious and become conscious, if that makes any sense at all.
It absolutely does. I mean, I think it's actually an excellent example of the ability, so there is a relationship, right, between subconscious processes and conscious processes, right? Generally speaking, it's generally one way. It's generally that the subconscious feeds signals up to your conscious awareness. But lucid dreaming is absolutely right, and I'm familiar with actually I did podcast episodes on lucid dreaming, I think 2 of them, where we talked about some of the more successful strategies that people have to increase the likelihood, increase their propensity for having lucid dreams. And
I hate that I missed that one. I have to look through your episodes.
Well, it sounds like you're quite familiar. But essentially what you're doing is like you're essentially like putting a little hook in an environment, right? So it's not that you're consciously like dictating to your subconscious processes to behave in certain ways. Rather, you're setting up an environment that will inevitably, or hopefully, interact with your subconscious in a way that will trigger an awareness, right? Like, whatever it is, like meditating, right? You're sort of devoting, as much energy as you can to, recognizing that you're in a dream and everything. But then there's also like, there have been strategies where there are these like glasses or like eye shades that have lights in them. And once a person enters REM sleep, those lights are activated, and you're basically tapping into your subconscious by
David LaBarge. did that experiment. If you've ever heard of him.
I can't remember the actual scientist's name, but I believe you.
Stephen Labarge. He's a psychopsychologist, and he's famous for doing that experiment with a number of students. He wrote the book Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming, which, in my opinion, is like the Bible of lucid dreaming. It's absolutely extensively amazing with its knowledge and wisdom inside. But it's I've read, you can actually buy those things online. Those little goggles that blink the lights and stuff. You can try it yourself.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, and there are other ones like putting a little vibratory mechanism on your finger that does essentially the same thing. But like what you're doing, your conscious, the neurons in your conscious awareness circuits, let's say, are not directly influencing subconscious processes, right? You're essentially short-circuiting it. It's kind of like you're basically just sculpting an environment that will cause your subconscious to react in ways that will predispose you to having a lucid dream. And so, when you say, like, is there a way for us to, basically have our conscious awareness invade our subconscious? It's through mechanisms like that, and we do it all the time. Like when you think about, you spend time exposing your mind to certain information. In one case, you've learned quite a bit about lucid dreaming, right? But you could, be training yourself to, be really good at playing the guitar, or, you spend time going to school, right? You are fundamentally part of maturation. Part of the whole benefit of going to school is sculpting how those subconscious, evolutionarily primitive parts of the brain that are associated with urges and, desires and these types of things, you're essentially making it so that you are, by sculpting an environment, you're making it so that the environment has an intended effect on how the subconscious operates. That's essentially the only way that I could ever think of doing it.
With sculpting, and correct me if I'm wrong, would it be more like what you're saying is fine-tuning and almost like on a guitar with a note, tightening the strings in a way to where when you try to think of that name Carol, like, oh my God, I can't think of it. Is it maybe because the brain wants to do it and present it to you so fast that it goes through, essentially thousands and thousands of words maybe that it has to inhibit to try to, by processes of elimination, kind of like, okay, I have these names, I have to give it to them in the blink of an eye. So, okay, it's this one. And then there's another part of your brain that's like, no, I don't have the name recorded, but I do have recorded that name is wrong, And is it maybe like fine-tuning the brain so much so that an episode like that of forgetting a name and not being able to pull it from your memory immediately can kind of dissipate the more you fine-tune your brain, the more you train your brain to get those quickly? Because I guess in everything, the more you do it, the tighter you're going to be, the more, the better you're going to be at it.
Yeah. Essentially, yeah. A different example, would be, let's, sticking with our friend Carol here, like one way that you would do that is if you just engage Carol more frequently in your life, right? Then you're just much less likely to have this happen, where it's like, it's just sort of, it's just above threshold of memory. It's like, oh yeah, Carol, like I met her one time at a party or something like that,
But it also happened before with people that you would maybe know. You're like,
sure.
Oh my God, I just watched the movie, or I just saw this person 2 days ago. How is that name not there? I know their name. It's not there.
Sure.
So you know it well, and then for whatever reason, the brain just like trips up and is like, whoop.
Sure. Yeah.
Gave you the wrong name.
The brain is definitely, it's error prone in general always, but like, that's one way. But another, way that's perhaps a little bit more similar to like, again, sort of having your conscious awareness invade your subconscious is with delayed gratification. So basically, if you, instead of, like tonight, I know I have some ice cream sandwiches in the freezer, right? And, if after I have dinner, I could eat the whole box of ice cream sandwiches, right? And it would be very tasty. I would enjoy that, right? but it would be bad for me, right? And I know it's bad for me. And so I exercise, so, I'll maybe have an ice cream sandwich at some point later, right? Some other day. But tonight I'm exercising some discipline, right? I'm delaying that gratification. What's literally happening is that regions of the brain that are more closely associated with conscious awareness are sending inhibitory signals to those urges, to that urge to have that delicious food. And every time you do that, every time you delay gratification, you get better at delaying gratification, right? So that system, that circuit is actually, it's essentially strengthened. And so, you know, it is sort of like training that property of consciousness. And so, yeah, it's just essentially through repetition.
Man, I love you, bro.
Thanks for calling in, man.
I always love your mind and what your mind puts forth, man. Just keep shining the way you do, bro.
I appreciate it. Thanks for calling in. And listen, once Periscope shutters, I hope you'll check out, well, either youtube.com/anthropoid, or haps.tv. You can find links in my profile, because you always bring up really interesting topics, man.
You too, man. YouTube.com/ what is it? Anthropoid?
Yeah, Anthropoid. It's in my profile page on Periscope. You can just find it there.
Oh, okay. Awesome. You're the best, Ian.
All right.
You so much,
Thanks for
bro.
calling in, man. It's awesome. There's some really good topics today, huh? Like, really substantive. So on YouTube, Frank is, hi, Ian. Yes, that's funny. I felt like I got an answer correct. Because when you asked the question, I said the same. Basically, you're rewarded for surviving. Yeah, essentially, that's right. The reason we feel reward is because it's associated with things that will promote survival, right? Or promote reproductive success at a minimum. So it looks like we're connected. Abyss, the infamous Abyss. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, what's up, Ian? How's it going?
Not bad. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. So I just wanted to weigh in on some of the things that you said. Well, technically, like, you know, you mentioned, like, you know, the olfactory, or the olfaction is like sort of a constellation of different senses, or different you know, neurons being activated, and that's actually true. So like, you know, a single neuron or a single olfactory nerve, it can actually detect multiple chemicals, and that constellation is what leads it to essentially register that as a chemical signal, or smell signal that can be recognized by the brain. Right. I guess my question is, we know that there are, you know, variations in the genetics that would cause some change in perception. Like, for example, we have super tasters that have more inclined to taste bitterness in the food that they eat. Full disclosure, I'm a super taster as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So, do you think that, you know, certain genetic variants also cause, you know, some kind of change when it comes to olfaction in that regard?
It's an interesting question, interesting topic. I actually don't know that we have like a really good answer to that question, like that we've explored the genetics underlying super tasting and stuff like that. You know, my suspicion would be that there's probably a little bit of both. That there's probably, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, you know, the olfactory system is a very dynamic place, right, in terms of like expression of receptor proteins and stuff, and of course that's all going to be genetically regulated, right? The rate of receptor recycling and you know, new receptors being generated. It's actually a really fascinating process, like how new receptors are generated, but you know, so there is at least some room for some genetic, you know, polymorphism, at least in whatever it is that regulates, you know, that determines when and how much and how different, you know, receptors a person will have. But I also suspect that, you know, like you know, my brother is a chef, and he's, you know, he's one of the most creative and brilliant chefs I've ever experienced in my life, and you know, he trained, like he spent years getting good at that, you know, and like cooking at some of the best restaurants in Miami and then in California, and you know, and like, you know, I suspect that being exposed to just a wide, you know, portfolio of olfactory experiences also can influence, you know, how sensitive one is to being able to distinguish, you know, this form of basil from this form of basil, or, you know, a Syrah from a Zinfandel, right? That, you know, there's probably a bit of a predisposition there, some genetic variability there, but then it's also an environmental thing, right? Like by necessity. That would be my suspicion. What do you think?
Yeah, because I believe that, you know, most smells are actually subjective. If you notice, like something that might smell quite nice and comforting for some, it might it might offend the other.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
There's no generalization when it comes to olfaction. I think it's massively sculpted by our behavior and our upbringings. Actually, most of the time.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about that. Actually, you know what? One of the interesting things that I brought up on youtube.com/anthropoid for anybody, is that we've been mostly focused on the effect of COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2, on the loss of smell, like, either hyposmia or anosmia. But there's some really interesting interviews that were done by, I think her name is Claire, I'm forgetting her name, Claire, who cares? She's the president of the Rhinological Society in London. And, she's been getting information where it's not just the loss or the attenuation of smell, it's actually a severe change in the experience of smell, where somebody's favorite food goes from being delicious and smelling great to smelling repulsive and vile, which, again, like that sort of variability, that malleability of emotional associations with certain olfactory experiences, I think is very, very fascinating. And, I think we're going to learn a lot from from identifying what distinguishes a response like that to COVID-19 from anosmia, the loss of smell altogether, from people who have no experience of that at all, which everybody that I know that caught COVID-19 has not experienced that.
That kind of begs the question, like, does conditions like COVID-19 or any kind of evolution, or at least change and progression, as trying to accustom yourself to different kinds of senses, does that profoundly change how the stem cells from the glomeruli actually essentially start to resurface and start becoming the olfactory bulbs, which profoundly changes their reception? Because if there's substantial change and the cells that have gone through apoptosis due to COVID or something, do they is the chemical signal that used to cause pleasant sensation also lost?
Right. That association.
Exactly, because you would assume that the stem cells that will be taking on the olfactory bulbs will have the same kind of receptors that are being expressed. At least that was my assumption. I could be wrong on this front, but if that's profoundly changed, then I think that would raise more questions as to how our sense of smell evolves or starts to change.
I think that absolutely makes sense. And I had only ever seen the reports of anosmia, and so my suspicion was that it was just a local effect of either the virus directly on olfactory receptors or maybe even the bulb. But all of these sort of variations in radical changes in olfaction make me feel like there might be, it may be more likely that there's something actually happening in the brain and not just at the site of primary sensory receptors. But yeah, I don't know, and maybe it can be both. It may just be one. But it also, I think what you bring up is interesting. If those neurons are lost, right, through apoptosis, right, then those neurons were probably sending signals to, or at least influencing, a much broader variety than just the categorization that the olfactory system can do, where it's this is in the the beer category of olfaction. This is in the cheese category. There's also those limbic projections that then inevitably, and then of course memory associated projections. And so if that neuron that is either directly or indirectly influencing all those systems is lost, then that whole association is completely lost, and now ready to be re-sculpted by the environment. My daughter is still learning her sensory systems, right? And she's going to spend 18 years, probably, hopefully, knock on wood, receiving certain sensory categorizations and olfactory molecules that are determined largely by her parents. And so that's a long time, right? And so, like you're saying, childhood probably plays a very significant role in all of those associations. And so all of a sudden, those associations that took years and years to form are now gone. Like, I don't know, it's very interesting. It's quite tragic too.
Yeah, actually, the last thing that you said makes perfect sense. Like, if there is a smell association, and if the connection is actually lost, like to the amygdala or the orbital prefrontal cortex, which is essentially like helps us decide like which smell is what. Then if this connection is actually severed, then you're right. I mean, that would cause sort of a rewiring in how we associate different smells.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're going to be learning a lot just given how many people have caught this virus. You know, like there's probably going to be a lot of opportunities for human research, for better or worse. You know.
Definitely.
Well, listen, man. As always, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I see you over on HAPS, hopefully. But until then, have a good one, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for calling.
I'll make my transition.
Right on. All right.
Sure.
We're looking forward to it, so I'll see you there.
Sure.
All right. See you, man. So interesting topic. So I was wondering if this relates to the change in palate differences for children to adulthood. I love that topic. I talked about it on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. It's well known that, you know, olfactory sensitivities and associations evolve as we get older. And it certainly happened to me. And I am not familiar, maybe this research does exist, I just haven't seen it, but I'm not familiar with any mechanistic explanation for the loss of sensitivity apart from maybe like, you know, fewer olfactory receptors being expressed or something like that. I could imagine that being the case, but I doubt it would be that simple. But yeah, for sure. Like it absolutely relates to like why, you know, there's a sort of a stereotype that as people get older, they just start pouring salt onto their food because they can't taste anything. And by the way, that number that I was struggling to get, in terms of the comparison between glomeruli and odor receptors between, you know, humans and mice, is that humans have 16 olfactory bulb glomeruli that are processing information from each odor receptor compared to just 2 olfactory bulb glomeruli doing the same in the rodent. So that's pretty interesting. That is a difference. I do believe, however, that proportionally, you know, mice and dogs and everything have dramatically more olfactory receptors, right? So they're capable of, you know, distinguishing molecularly between similar structures. Anyways, I should probably call it a day. So thank you for joining me, everybody. Awesome topics today. Really, really interesting. I appreciate it. So I have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/anthropoid. I have a link in my Periscope bio if you're interested in checking it out. Today I talked about olfaction quite a bit more than I anticipated I would, but it was really fun. And if you dig the types of topics, maybe you'll consider subscribing. I also am using a new streaming platform called HAPS, haps.tv, which you can check out. Also a link in my Periscope profile page. It's very similar to Periscope, but more tools, believe it or not. And you know, some of the scientists you know and love are over there today. Deanna Hooper, DC Hooper 91, did her first HAPS broadcast. You should check that out. Euromaestro, with whom we chatted earlier, is there. Isabel Betancourt, and a bug scientist, entomologist, is over there. And so come and join us, and hopefully we can continue these conversations after Periscope shutters. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you next week, same time, same place. See you there. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks, everybody watching on YouTube. I really appreciate it. Okay, what about smell? Like, able to smell someone sick, sad. Oh, you know what's interesting? Yeah, that is a very interesting body of research. I was flirting with the idea of getting into that. Like, you know, the like shocking evidence that like some animals can distinguish when somebody is in a disease state when there's no overt outward expression. I suspect that there's something the story is similar to the story that I talked about at the beginning on this YouTube of humans having preferences for for people with certain immune system proteins, right? The short story is that we tend to prefer people whose MHC proteins, major histocompatibility complex proteins. These are proteins that are involved in the immune system, and the immune system recognizing your cells from foreign cells to prevent your immune system from attacking yourself, to developing autoimmunity. I suspect, and we somehow seem to be able to detect that. And you can go back to the beginning and review that if you're interested in the evidence a little bit more. Somehow there's what appears to be some olfactory mechanism by which we can detect that. It's amazing. And I suspect that, whether it's cancer, whether it's, a variety of disease states are associated with changes in the immune system, changes in levels of proteins and cell expression and all that kind of stuff. And so and circulating neurotransmitters and hormones. And so I would imagine that is something that, like dogs are capable of detecting, whereas we just don't have the machinery, right? Because we're not nearly as driven by pheromones and stuff like that as dogs are. And so they have the machinery that can detect these subtle changes in, pheromones, in molecules, right? That change is a function of changes in our body. So interesting topic. Thanks for bringing it up. If you enjoyed this and you haven't subscribed, I hope you'll consider it. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, everybody. Great.